So hello there everyone, I'm Nurse Don and welcome to pharmacology class. In previous video, we discussed about your pharmacokinetics. We discussed about the absorption, digestion, metabolism, and how drugs are being excreted. So we discussed about the elimination or excretion, and we also discussed about volume distribution, clearance. It is also essential to compute the half-life, first pass metabolism, first order kinetics, and zero order kinetics. Now let's jump to pharmacodynamics. So what about your pharmacodynamics? So this video will be a topic about your pharmacodynamics. Okay, what is a pharmacodynamics? This is also an essential part or aspect of your pharmacology. Pharmacodynamics, okay, again derived from the term pharmacon, meaning the word pharmacon refers to drug, and the term dynamics refer to power. So what is a pharmacodynamics? Pharmacodynamics is simply described as the study. It is the of the effects study of the of drugs, effects of drugs on the body, effects of drugs on the body. So your pharmacodynamics, it is the study of the mechanism by which drug dosages they act to produce biochemical or physiological changes in the body. So that's the action of the drug in the body, why this drug is given, what is this drug doing to the body. So it causes mostly the desired effect. The drug acts within the body in order to mimic, so parang ginagaya niya yung action ng body's own chemical messengers. So those response of the drug can cause a primary or a secondary physiologic effects or both. It could be desirable or undesirable. Now going back to what pharmacodynamic is. Pharmacodynamics is the mechanism by which the drug they produce biochemical or physiological changes. So pharmacodynamics is simply includes the physiological, biochemical effects of the drugs, mechanism of action at organ system, or maybe to the subcellular or cellular level or cellular stage. So in simple terms, your pharmacodynamics is simply the study of what? A study of what the drug do to the body, what the drug to do, sorry, what the drug do to the body as contrast to what we call your pharmacodynamics as what the body does to the drug. Ang pharmacodynamics naman, it is simply related to what the drug does to the body. What the drug does to the body, what the drug do, how the drug do, how the drug do. Okay. And what are the actions of the drug, which refers to the mechanism of action, mechanism of actions, and also includes the mechanism of actions, also includes what? Also includes the, yes, physiological and biochemical effects of the drug. Also included the physiological, 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 what else? Biochemical, okay? Physiological or the biochemical effects of the drug, okay? Effects of drugs, okay? So that is the concept of your pharmacodynamics. Again, pharmacodynamics, it refers to the study of the effects of the drug on the body, what the drug does to the body, and in contrast to your pharmacokinetics, what the body does to the drug. Here, pharmacodynamics is what the drug does to the body. So the response of a drug can cause primary or secondary physiologic effect or both. So a primary effect, that is the desirable response, and a secondary effect, that is desirable or undesirable. Let me give you an example. Diphenhydramine. Diphenhydramine. As you know that diphenhydramine is an antihistamine. So its primary effect, guys, is to treat the symptoms of an allergy. The secondary effect, my dear nurses, since your diphenhydramine is an antihistamine, as you know that the secondary effect, it causes depression of your CNS, your central nervous system. Because the nature of diphenhydramine as an antihistamine is a CNS down, CNS depression, causes depression of your CNS. It causes what? Drowsiness. So its secondary effect there, it is either desirable or undesirable. It is undesirable when the patient drives a car because it causes drowsiness. So dun papasok ngayon ang ating role as a nurse. When a patient receives this particular drug, specifically antihistamine, you have to instruct the patient that this drug causes drowsiness. You have to give the side effect or the adverse effect. And the desirable effect of this drug, it could be desirable at bedtime because it causes a mild sedation. Okay, so that is about your pharmacodynamics. What the drug do to the body, how the drug do, what is the action, the effect of sequence, the dose-effect relationship. So those are pertaining to what we call as your pharmacodynamics. So that is about the concept of your pharmacodynamics. So we started with what? With number one, okay, the definition of your pharmacodynamics. So we started with the definition of your pharmacodynamics. Now, we proceed to other concept of your pharmacodynamics, which are very essential, important. They are notable in your exams as well. Other concept that you should know about your pharmacodynamics is your number two. We're done with the definition. Now we go to the aspects of your pharmacodynamics. Aspects of pharmacodynamics. There are numerous aspects of your pharmacodynamics. We'll go them one by one. Pharmacodynamics. Okay. Excuse. One, the concept of your dose-response relationship. Okay, your dose-response relationship. Dose-response relationship. Okay. Let me just change the color there. Okay, what is a dose-response relationship? Dose-response relationship is simply described as the body's. It is the body's physiologic response. Okay, physiologic response. It is the normal. It is the internal response of the body. It's the body's physiologic response. Body's physiologic response to changes. To changes in drug concentration at the site of action, at the site of action. The body's physiologic, so that's the normal, so that's the internal response of the body in a particular changes with the amount of a drug concentration at a specific site of your action. Now, to further understand your dose response relationship, there are two concepts to further describe this relationship. So we have the concept of your what we call your potency and what we call your the other one is your efficacy. So to understand further the concept of your dose response relationship, which is the physiologic response, that's the normal response of the body to certain changes to amount of a drug at the action, okay, at the specific site of the action. To understand the relationship of your dose response, we need to understand what is a potency and what is efficacy. What is the difference between? So under your number one, we have your potency and your efficacy. What is the difference between potency and your efficacy? We need to understand, differentiate the two. Because if you going to see the potency and your what we call efficacy, halos same yung mga yan eh. Halos parehas yung ibig sabihin. But what is the line of demarcation between your potency and your efficacy? Let's discuss first what is a potency. Potency, this term, it refers to the amount. It refers to the amount of drug. Amount of drug needed or necessary in order to what? In order to elicit a response. In order to create a physiologic response to a drug. Okay, to a drug. Remember that, class. Okay, refers to the amount of drug that is necessary to elicit a physiologic response to a drug. So potency simply means ilan ang kailangan mong amount ng drug to create or to bring out that physiologic response na tinatawag po natin. So potency, guys, it is related to the dosage that produces a given physiologic response in a specific amplitude na tinatawag po natin. It is the power of a drug at a specific concentration. Okay, that is usually measured by the effective concentration of a drug designated as your EC50, leading to half its maximal effect 50%. Let me write that one, class. Potency, class, in other words, in simpler terms, okay, it is the power of a drug. Power of a drug at a specific concentration. Specific concentration. Usually measured by the effective concentration. Usually measured by the effective concentration of drug. Effective concentration of drug. Usually designated as what? Okay, usually designated as, okay, let me change the color. Usually designated as your EC50. Okay, your EC50. Leading to half its maximal effect of your 50% responses. Now, what is your EC50 or your effective concentration of a drug? Your EC50, class, this is the needed amount of a drug, how much the drug is needed to reach 50% of the maximum response. Okay, so what is your EC50? EC50 refers to how much, okay, how much the drug is needed to reach the 50% of the maximum response. So in short, your potency, class, it refers to the dosage, amount of drug na kailangan po natin in order to create a physiologic response in a specific amplitude. Yun yung tinatawag natin na potency na tinatawag po natin. How much the drug is needed to reach 50% of the maximum response. So, the more potent the drug, the easier to achieve 50% of the maximum response, obviously. Kasi ang potency mo, It is actually the needed amount of drug dosage that can elicit, that can produce, that can create a physiologic response in a specific amplitude. So the more potent the drug, the easier for the drug to achieve the 50% maximum response, which is designated by your EC50, so, which can be directly obtained in a dose response curve, which I will illustrate it later. So the more potent the drug, it requires a lower dosage to produce the same effect as a higher dose of the other drug. So meaning, the more the potent the drug, remember this class, potent, the more potent the drug, the more potent the drug, the lower the EC50. Anong ibig sabihin yan, class? The more potent the drug, the lower the EC50. Meaning, the more potent the drug, the easier for that drug to achieve the 50% maximum response. The more potent the drug, it requires lower dosage. Ayun, the more potent the drug, the lower the EC50. Ano pa? The lower dosage. Okay, to produce. The lower dosage to produce the same effect. The same effect. Let me give you an example, class. Para maintindihan mo yan. Okay? Let me give you an example. Okay, let me give you an example. Like for instance, drug A. Okay, we have this, drug A. Drug A has an effect of 500 milligram. Okay, drug A has an effect of 500 milligram, while drug B has the same effect to 5 milligram. I'll repeat. Your drug A has an effect of 500 milligram, whereas your drug B has the same effect to 5 milligram. So, alin dyan ang mas potent? Yung drug A na 500 milligram o yung drug B na 5 milligram? By applying the concept of your potency. I'll repeat, class. Potency refers to the amount of drug. Dosage of drug. Okay? Ang potency mo, ilan ba ang kailangan kong amount ng drug, dosage of drug, which can produce. Okay? Which can produce. That is necessary for me to elicit a specific physiologic response to a drug. Ilan ang kailangan kong amount ng drug to create, to produce, to elicit a particular specific physiologic response in a specific amplitude. The more the potent the drug, the lower the EC50. Anong ibig sabihin nun? Pag mas potent ang drug, it would be easier for that drug to achieve the 50% maximum response, which can be obviously obtained in a dose-response curve. So, the more potent the drug, the lower dosage to produce the same effect. Ayun yung sagot. So, alin ang mas potent dyan? Obviously, it's drug B. Why? Drug B is more potent. Remember, the more potent the drug, the lower the dosage to produce the same effect. So, drug B is more potent. Ng ilang beses? More potent meaning drug B is 100 times more potent. Okay, 100 times more potent than drug A. You have to remember, class. As a nurse, you have to remember kung ano ang mas potent na drug, ano ba ang mas potent na drug. For example, a drug with high potency, example, fentanyl. It produces significant therapeutic response of higher or lower concentration. Remember, the more potent the drug, the lower the EC50. The more potent the drug, the lower dosage. So, if fentanyl has high potency, produces significant therapeutic response of low concentration or high concentration? Low concentration. So, yung ibig sabihin ng tinatawag natin na potency na tinatawag po natin. Now, the other concept that you should know about your drug response relationship aside from your potency is your efficacy. Okay. What about your efficacy? Ano naman, sir, yung efficacy? Kasi ang potency, it refers to the amount of drug dosage that produces given response. Your efficacy class, sorry, efficacy, it is the ability of a drug to elicit a response. Sir, parang ganun din naman na, okay, ability of a drug to cause expected response. So, parang wala silang pinagkaiba kanina. Let me write that one. Okay, efficacy is the ability. It is simply the ability of a drug, to elicit. Ability. Kanina, amount of drug yung potent na tinatawag natin. Here, your efficacy, it is the ability of a drug to elicit a physiologic response. Ganun din naman, sir, ah. Okay? So, parang parehas lang sila. Take note, sa potency, dosage, amount of drug that is needed to produce a physiologic response. Ito, hindi lang hanggang dyan yung definition niya. Efficacy is the ability of a drug to elicit a response when, may karugtong, when it interacts. Yan, when it interacts with a receptor. Okay, this receptor might be commonly proteins yung mga yan. Could be ion channels, ligand ion channels, it could be chemical enzymes, and so forth. We'll go there. Okay, so this is dependent on the number of drug receptor. Sa potency kasi, amount of drug yung kailangan mo para mag-create, mag-elicit, mag-produce ka ng response. In efficacy, since it interacts with the receptor, it would now dependent on the number of drug receptor complexes and the efficiency of the coupling of receptor that will activate a cellular response. So, efficacy is the ability of drug to induce a functional change in receptor. Yun yung difference nila. Effect of drug as a function of binding. Yan. Efficacy is the ability of a drug na magbabind doon sa different receptors, mostly mga proteins sa mga yan. So, yung tinatawag natin na efficacy. Okay? Efficacy, in simple terms, it is the ability of drug to cause expected response. Let me write that one. Okay? Cause expected response. Yun yung tinatawag natin na efficacy. Okay, efficacy. Oops. Nasaan na yung ating cursor? Okay, nawawala. Ayun, ayun, ayun. One moment. Bilang susulat ng pen natin. Ayun niya yata siguro ng color white. Okay, let me change that. Yan. Oh, yeah. It's not even writing. So, efficacy, again, is the ability of a drug in order to induce a functional change in receptor when it binds to a particular receptor. It is the effect of a drug as a function of binding. Now, ayan, okay? Let me write that one, class. Your efficacy is the ability, okay, it is the ability of drug to induce, functional, to induce a functional change in receptor. Okay, functional change in receptor. So obviously, it is simply described as the effect of a drug, as a function of binding. Yan. Yun yung ibig sabihin ng tinatawag natin na efficacy. So that is the difference between your efficacy and your, what we call this, potency, for you to understand what is a dose-response relationship. So we're discussing, guys, the aspects of your pharmacodynamics. We started with number one, that's dose response. Dose response, for us to understand, I discussed the terms potency and efficacy. Now, let's proceed. Another term, okay, another aspect. Okay, number two, another aspects. Number two, what is affinity? Okay, what is affinity? What is your affinity? What about, sir, your affinity? Ano naman ang affinity? Tapos na tayo sa potency, tapos na tayo sa efficacy. Ano naman yung affinity? Affinity is simply described as the attractiveness, okay? Attractiveness of a drug. Attractiveness of a drug to its receptor. Attractiveness of a drug to its receptor. So this is a force of attraction between drug and your receptor. How attractive the drug to the protein, to the binding to receptor, to enzymes, and so forth. So affinity, it refers to the strength of the interaction. It is the strength of binding between a ligand and its receptor na tinatawag po natin. It's simply stated as the ability of drug to bind to receptor. Yun. Okay. Ability of a drug. Ability of a drug to bind to receptor. To bind to receptor. The strength of the binding between a ligand and its receptor. Let me show you what is a ligand class. Ito. Mamaya we'll go there. Okay? Ligand, where are you? Later. Ability of a drug to bind to a particular receptor. So how attracted the drug to the protein, binding to receptor enzymes, and represented by dissociation constant. It is represented, okay, represented by what we call a KD, o yung tinatawag po natin na dissociation constant. We will illustrate those. Okay, constant. So the lower the dissociation constant, the higher the affinity of the drug. So they are inversely proportional. Okay, what is a KD or dissociation constant? So technically your KD is simply described, okay, simply described as the concentration, of a drug, needed, that is needed to occupy 50% of the receptors. Concentration of a drug needed to occupy 50% of the receptors. So again, affinity is the strength, okay, the ability, the capability, the, the strength of binding, the strength of interaction between a ligand and its receptor na tinatawag natin. Okay, so that's about your affinity. Other aspects that you should know of about your pharmacodynamics, so we're done with dose response relationship subdivided into terms na kailangan natin para malaman natin ang dose response. We have your potency and your efficacy. Now we are done with your affinity. Now we go to number three. What is a maximal? Okay, what is a maximal efficacy? Maximal efficacy. Okay? Or designated as your Emax na tinatawag natin. Your Emax, that is the point at which maximum. Okay, the point at which increasing a drug's dosage no longer increases no longer increases the desired, okay, no longer increases the desired therapeutic response. No longer increases the desired therapeutic response. And we can appreciate this class by illustrating what is a drug dose curve. Okay. So what is a maximal efficacy, or what we call your Emax? The point at which increasing increasing a drug dose no longer increases the desired therapeutic response. What do you mean by that, class? Maximal efficacy, or Emax, that is the point in which there's no further increase in response. Kahit anong gawin mo, okay, there is no further increase in the response. Kumbaga, naabot na niya yung kanyang tinatawag na maximum efficacy, or yung tinatawag natin your ceiling effect na tinatawag. Okay, that is your ceiling effect na tinatawag po natin. Okay, let me show you a drug response curve for you to appreciate about the effect of a drug, the dose, the maximal efficacy, and so forth. Okay, let me show you an illustration. Okay, number 4, other concept that you should know, aspects of your pharmacodynamics. Dose response, affinity, maximal efficacy. Number 4, drug response curve. Okay, drug response. Okay, what is a drug response curve? Drug response curve. A drug response curve, class, it's also a very important aspect of your pharmacodynamics. It is simply a curve or a graph that is used to provide, sorry, it is used to provide information about the dosage range over which, okay, over which the drug is effective, as well as the peak response, okay, as well as the peak response that can be expected from the drug. So your drug response curve has two types, your type 1 and your type 2 drug response curve. Your type 1 and your type 2 response curve. Let me illustrate your particular graph, class. Okay. Sensya na, hindi talaga ako marunong mag-drawing. Yung talagang talent talaga na hindi binigay sa akin. Oh my gosh. Perfect, straight. Kahit hindi ako straight. Charot. Okay, so we have the effect of a drug here. Effect of a drug. Okay, so this is the high effect of a drug. This is the low effect of a drug. And then, loko to. Then we have here the dose of a drug. Okay, dose of drug. So here your high dose of a drug and low dose of a drug. Okay, now, this is about a graph, your dose versus efficacy of the drug. Dose versus the efficacy of a drug. So your type 1, so this is your type 1. This is simple illustration of your type 1 dose response curve. Type 1 dose response curve. Okay. So your x-axis indicates your dose of a drug, while as your y-axis indicates a response, which is the efficacy or the effect of a drug, which can be either a sigmoid form, okay, or a log form. Okay. Nasaan dyan yung tinatawag natin na maximal efficacy na tinatawag? Remember that your efficacy of a drug, it can be either hyperbolic, it could be sigmoid, or log form. So, ganito ang itsura niyan. Oh, Okay, there. Okay. Oops. Wait lang. Parang may mali. Mukha na siyang sickle. Your your graph, it could be a hyperbolic, it could be a log form or a sigmoid. Let me illustrate. Yan. Okay? So this point class, ayan, this point, ayan, yung point na yan, that is actually what we call the maximal efficacy. That is actually what we call your maximal efficacy or what we call your Emax na tinatawag natin. Ano nga ulit yung Emax na tinatawag natin? That is what? The point at which increasing a drug's dosage no longer increases the desired therapeutic response. So that is the ceiling point, the point in which there's no further increase in response. So ibig sabihin, after this point, after this point, increasing doses do not produce now a stronger effect. Yun yung ibig sabihin ng maximal efficacy. So, after this point, class, after this point, increasing dosage, kahit itaas mo pa ng itaas yan, it does not produce now a stronger effect. So, that is what we call a drug response curve illustrating your maximal efficacy. Illustrating your maximal efficacy. So we are done. Closely related to dose response and efficacy is the therapeutic index na tinatawag natin. Your therapeutic index. So we are discussing the aspects of pharmacodynamics. We are done with number 1. You have your dose response curve. So we discuss about under your dose response curve your potency and your affinity. Potency and efficacy rather. And then number 2, we have your affinity, correct? And then number 3, we have your maximal efficacy. And then we have number 4, we have your drug response curve. Now we go to your therapeutic index, which are closely related to dose response and efficacy. They are closely related, class. Number 5. We are now at number 5, aspect of your pharmacodynamics. What about, sir, your therapeutic index? Ano naman ang tinatawag nating therapeutic index? Or commonly designated as your TI. Okay, your therapeutic index. Therapeutic index, class, it describes the relationship. It describes the relationship between describes the relationship between the therapeutic dose of a drug, commonly designated as your ED50, and the toxic dose of a drug. Again, therapeutic index, it describes the relationship between therapeutic dose of a drug, indicated by the ED50, and the dose and the toxic dose of a drug. Toxic dose of a drug, commonly indicated as your TD50. Okay, indicated by a TD50. Toxic drug dose. Your TD50 na tinatawag natin. Relationship. Okay, it describes the relationship between therapeutic dose of a drug and the toxic dose of a particular drug. So it is simply the difference between these 2 points. It is the difference between 2 points. Difference between the therapeutic dose and the toxic dose of a drug. That is your therapeutic index. What is ED50 and what is TD50? O, para maintindihan lang natin. The difference between your ED50 and your TD50, yun yung tinatawag natin na therapeutic index na tinatawag. Now, what is an ED50? What is ED50 and what is your TD50? Okay? Pag sinabi nating ED50, it is simply refers, okay, to the dose. It is simply the dose of a drug. Dose of a drug that produces what? That produces a therapeutic. Okay, that is the expected effect of a drug. Okay, therapeutic effect. That's the desired effect of a drug. Therapeutic effect or therapeutic response. Okay, in 50% of the population. In 50% of the population. So that's an estimation. While your TD50, oh, ano ang tinatawag na TD50? The toxic. Okay, the toxic dose of a drug. Your your TD50 is the dose. It is simply described as the dose of a drug that produces, ito therapeutic, ito produces a toxic response. Obviously, a toxic response in 50% of the population. 50% of the population. So, ED50, that is the dose of a drug in order to produce a therapeutic response. While your TD50, dose of a drug that produces what? A toxic response. So again, therapeutic index is the relationship between the therapeutic dose and the toxic dose. In simple terms, class, your therapeutic index, that is simply the difference between therapeutic dose and the toxic dose. So why this therapeutic index is very important? So if the ED50 and TD50 are close, the drug is said to have a narrow therapeutic index. The difference between 2 points, that's the therapeutic index. So if the ED50 and TD50 are close, ano ibig sabihin nun? The drug is said to have a narrow therapeutic index. A particular drug that has a narrow therapeutic index. So may mga narrow therapeutic index. What are those? Okay, narrow therapeutic. Okay, narrow therapeutic index. Okay, narrow therapeutic index. We have warfarin. Okay, we have warfarin. We have digoxin. Okay, we have your digoxin. And we have your phenytoin. Phenytoin. Okay, those are the examples of drugs that has a narrow therapeutic index. So as a nurse, if the patient receives this particular drug na merong narrow therapeutic index such as your warfarin, digoxin, your phenytoin, what would be your nursing responsibility? That is important in pharmacology. Okay? Yun yung importante doon eh. Nursing process is very important in your pharmacology. It is not about knowing the drug. It's not knowing about only the effect of a drug. You have that nursing responsibility. That's very important. Nursing responsibility. What would be your nursing responsibility when the patient receives warfarin, digoxin, phenytoin? As you know that this particular examples of drugs, they have that narrow therapeutic index. Anong ibig sabihin ba, sir, pag narrow therapeutic index? So, ibig sabihin your patient is at risk if that particular drug has a narrow therapeutic index. So, anong gagawin ko dyan? Ang nursing responsibility mo dyan, what is your nursing responsibility? It requires what? Yes, close monitoring of the patient to ensure, obviously, patient safety. To ensure patient's safety. Okay, that would be your nursing responsibility. The patient receives warfarin, digoxin, and phenytoin because those medications have that narrow therapeutic index na tinatawag natin. Now, let me illustrate. Ano ang therapeutic index? What's ED50? What's TD50 na tinatawag po natin? Okay? If you can still remember, okay, when we discuss about your drug dose response curve, we have two types. Type 1 dose curve, so that the illustration of the dose of a drug, dosage of a drug, and the efficacy. And then you determine what is maximal efficacy or your Emax. Now this time, we have what we call as your type 2 dose response curve. Your type 2 dose response curve. What about your type 2 response curve? So this is about your, it's more of a dose versus a response of a patient. So this is more of holistic and more practical response than your type 1. Because in type 1, illustration of your type 1 dose curve is your dosage and the efficacy. While in type 2, it's about dose versus the response of your patient. So this is more holistic and more practical response. So we need an illustration again. Perfect. Okay, so we have here a 50%. Kailangan natin gumamit ng mga ibang kulay dito, class. Okay, kailangan natin gumamit ng mga ibang kulay. So here, 50%. Imagine mo lang straight yan. And then, we have your... And here is your 100%. So this is the percentage of individual that is responding to the dose. Percentage of individual responding to to a particular dose. Responding to a particular dose. So we have 50% and then your 100%. Now, this is about your human study. So we will illustrate what is your ED50 and what is your TD50. Okay, so that's your blue one. Illustrate muna natin, class. Okay, and then, ano pa bang kulay na pwede? Blue, tapos na yung blue. Ito na lang. Yellow. Ganda. And then, ayan. Okay. Okay. So, between this line, class, yan, between that particular line of your, so this is your ED50, and yung kulay yellow, class, that is your TD50, yan, the toxic drug dose na tinatawag natin. And the ED50, what is again your ED50? That's the therapeutic dose of a drug. So this is the therapeutic dose of a drug in color blue. This is the toxic dose of a drug. So if you're going to put the line, demarcation of your line po natin, ayan. Makikita po natin ito. This one. Okay? That particular line, na binabanggit ko ito, between this line, ayan, line relationship between ED50 and your TD50. The distance or the difference between your ED50 and your TD50 is termed as, ano ulit ang tawag natin doon? Yes, very good. That is what we call the therapeutic index na tinatawag. The difference between your ED50 and your TD50. Relationship with your ED50 and TD50, that is your therapeutic index na tinatawag po natin. That's the therapeutic index. Yung color blue na yan, class, that indicates your therapeutic effect. Indicates your therapeutic effect of a drug, the desired effect of a drug. Yung kulay yellow na yan, okay, this one, yung kulay yellow na yan, anong tawag natin dyan? Anong tawag natin? TD50. So what does your TD50 represent? That is the toxic effect of a drug. Ano yung pangatlo, sir? Okay? Hindi mo nang binanggit yan kanina. Ang binanggit mo lang kanina, ED50 tsaka TD50. Ano naman yung kulay white na yan? So we have this therapeutic effect. We have also your toxic, dose effect. Yung difference ng ED50 and TD50, ang tawag doon therapeutic index, the relationship between ED50 and TD50. Now, a particular drug does not only have a therapeutic effect, toxic effect. Meron din siyang tinatawag na LD50. What do you mean, sir, by LD50? That is what we call the lethal effect. Nakamamatay. Okay, lethal effect of a particular drug. Again, I'll repeat, therapeutic index, that is the ratio between the toxic dose of a drug and the therapeutic dose of a drug. So your ED50, that is the effective dose where 50% of population, ayon, 50% of population responded effectively. Meaning they are, ito, your ED50, that is the effective dose where 50% of population responded effectively, meaning they are being treated. Your TD50, that is the toxic dose where 50% of the population experience toxic side effects. And then your LD50 here, LD50 is the lethal dose where 50% of the population responded lethally or died. Again, therapeutic index is the ratio between the toxic dose and the therapeutic dose of a drug. Okay? Your ED50, it is the effective dose where 50% of the population responded effectively, meaning they were treated. And then your TD50, that is the toxic dose where 50% of the population experienced toxic side effect. Your LD50, that is the lethal dose where 50% of the population responded lethally or died. So that is all about your type 2 dose response curve.